Picture two cockpits in the same winter sky. They are not side by side. They are hundreds of miles apart, over different islands, over different stretches of the same ocean. But they are the same airplane, and the two men flying them are hunting the same thing. In one of those cockpits sits a quiet farm boy from the far north of Wisconsin. He does not much like to talk about himself. When reporters ask him how he feels, he mostly looks at his boots. He is the eldest of 9 children. He learned to shoot on a farm near a village most Americans have never heard of. And he has just become the most successful fighter pilot his country has ever produced. He has 40 confirmed victories. His name is Richard Bong. In the other cockpit sits a wiry, restless man with a mustache and a chip on his shoulder, a New Jersey boy raised in Florida who studied aeronautical engineering and never finished the degree because there was a war on. He is sharper tongued than Bong, more openly ambitious, and he is close. So close he can taste it. He has 38 confirmed victories. He is too short of the record, and he knows it down to the digit. His name is Thomas Maguire, and everyone calls him Tommy. Both of them are flying the P-38 Lightning, that unmistakable twin-boom, twin-engine fighter that ruled the skies of the Southwest Pacific. Both of them scored every single one of their victories in that airplane. Between them, they hold the 2 highest victory totals in the history of American air combat, and they hold those totals to this day. Nobody has ever beaten them. Nobody ever will, because the war that produced them is over. Here's the part the newsreels never quite told you. Within 8 months of that winter, both of these men would be dead. One of them died chasing the record. The other died after he had already won it. And in my view, the thing that killed them both was not the Japanese. It was a number. It was a number, and it was the men on the ground who turned that number into a prize, who understood something the pilots themselves could not afford to understand, that a fighter ace was worth more to the war effort as a photograph than as a pilot. This is the story of the 2 greatest aces America ever fielded. It is the story of a race that command invented, encouraged, publicized, and then quietly regretted. And it is the story of how the same machine that put both of these men on magazine covers could not, for all its power, keep either one of them alive. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to this story. To these groups, to these airplanes, I want to do it justice. So let me take you back, and let me start with the quiet one. Richard Ira Bong was born on the 24th of September, 1920, in Superior, Wisconsin, and raised on the family farm near the village of Poplar. His father, Carl, was a Swedish immigrant. Richard was the oldest of 9 children, which means he grew up doing the work of a second father, and it shows in everything written about him. He was steady, he was calm, he was the kind of young man who did his chores, hunted to put meat on the table, and did not say 3 words when one would do. He learned to fly through the civilian pilot training program while he was a student at Superior State Teachers College, and he enlisted in the Army Air Corps Cadet Program in 1941. One of the men who taught him to fly was a young instructor named Barry Goldwater, who would later become a United States Senator and run for president. Bong earned his wings and his commission in January of 1942. Now, here's the thing about Bong that his own commanders admitted, and it is the detail I find most revealing about him. He was not a natural marksman. Deflection shooting, the art of leading a moving target so your bullets and the enemy airplane arrive at the same point in space at the same instant, is the single hardest skill in air combat, and Bong was, by his own account, mediocre at it. So he solved the problem the way a farm boy solves a problem. He got closer. He closed the range until deflection barely mattered, until he was so near the enemy that he could not miss. He flew through the debris of aircraft he had just blown apart. On at least one occasion, he flew so close that he collided with his target and had to claim it as a probable rather than a kill. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it tells you exactly who this man was in the air. He compensated for a weakness by accepting more risk than anyone around him. He beat the best gunners in the theater not by outshooting them, but by outnerving them. That is not the profile of a reckless man. That is the profile of a man who had done the math and decided the math was acceptable. Remember that, because it is the exact opposite of how the other man in our story would die. Before he ever saw combat, Bong nearly got himself thrown out of the Air Corps. In June of 1942, flying out of Hamilton Field in California, he looped his P-38 around the Golden Gate Bridge and buzzed a fellow pilot's house low enough to blow the drying laundry off the line. The general who ran 4th Air Force at the time called him in for a dressing down. That general was George Kenney, and Kenney later wrote that even while he was chewing Bong out, he was thinking to himself that this was exactly the kind of aggressive young pilot he wanted. In his own book, Kenney put it plainly, He said, "We needed kids like this lad. Hold on to Kenney's name because George Kenney is going to run through this entire story like a wire." Kenney took Bong to the Southwest Pacific in the autumn of 1942 and assigned him eventually to the 9th Fighter Squadron, the Flying Knights, of the 49th Fighter Group, 5th Air Force. While the squadron was still waiting for its lightnings, Bong flew temporarily with another unit and scored his first 2 victories over Buna on the 27th of December, 1942, a 0 and an Oscar in a single fight. He was awarded the Silver Star for that action. He was not yet famous. He was just very, very good and getting better. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. It costs you nothing, and it lets me keep going back through squadron records and crash reports for stories like this one. Now, back to the 2 men and the number that would kill them. Let me introduce you properly to the other one, because Tommy Maguire is, in almost every way, Bong's mirror image, and the contrast is the whole point. Thomas Buchanan Maguire Jr. was born on the 1st of August, 1920, in Ridgewood, New Jersey. His parents separated, and he and his mother moved south to Sebring, Florida, where he grew up and graduated high school. He went to Georgia Tech to study aeronautical engineering. He marched in the band. He was in the Cadet Corps. He was, by the accounts of the people who knew him, brilliant, prickly, intense, and absolutely certain he was destined for something. He left college after 3 years to enlist as an aviation cadet in July of 1941, and he won his wings at Kelly Field in Texas in February of 1942, the same winter Bong got his. Maguire's war did not start in the tropics. It started in the cold. His first combat tour was in the Aleutian Islands, up in the fog and the wind off Alaska, flying the P-39 era Cobra, an airplane most pilots despised. He saw almost no action there, and I think that mattered more than people give it credit for. Maguire spent the opening act of the war watching from the wrong theater while the real fighting happened somewhere else. When he finally got to the Southwest Pacific in the spring of 1943, he arrived hungry in a way that Bong never was. Bong wanted to do his job well. Maguire wanted to be the best, and he wanted everyone to know it. Maguire started out briefly in the same squadron as Bong, the 9th of the 49th Group. But within a few months, he transferred to a brand new outfit that Kenney had willed into existence, the 475th Fighter Group, nicknamed Satan's Angels. Specifically, he went to its 431st Fighter Squadron, the Hades Squadron. The 475th was unusual. It was formed in a combat zone in Australia in May of 1943, and it flew nothing but P-38s from the day it stood up. It would go on to become the highest scoring fighter group in the entire 5th Air Force. Maguire was one of the reasons why. And he announced himself fast. Over Wewak, on the 18th and 19th of August, 1943, Maguire shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in 2 days, 3 Oscars, and a Tony on the first day, 2 more the next, becoming an ace almost overnight. He named his airplanes Pudgy, after his wife Marilyn, and he painted the name and the squadron number on the nose, and he flew them hard. Then, that October, the war reminded Maguire that he was mortal. On the 17th of October 1943, over Oro Bay, he shot down 3 Japanese fighters and was then shot down himself, wounded, forced to bail out of a burning Lightning into the sea. A PT boat pulled him out of the water. He spent weeks in the hospital. And here is the thing that separates him from Bong at the level of character. The moment he was patched up, he did not slow down. He went back, and he pushed harder, as if the near death had only confirmed to him that time was short and the record was slipping away. So there they are. 2 men, both born in 1920, both winged in the winter of 1942, both flying the same magnificent airplane over the same ocean, one quiet, one loud, one who accepted risk with a farmer's calm arithmetic, one who chased it with a competitor's fever, and between them, a number that neither of them invented, but both of them served. Because here is what you have to understand about that number and about the race. The race was not an accident. It was a policy. When George Kenney took over Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific in 1942, he inherited a command that was exhausted, undersupplied, and losing. Morale was low. The distances were staggering, the conditions were brutal, and the men were tired. Kenney was a showman as much as he was an airman, and he understood something that the pure tacticians around him did not. He understood that men will fly and fight harder for a story than they will for a strategy. So he gave them a story. He gave them a race. The historian John Bruning tells this whole saga in his book, Race of Aces, and it is the single best account of what Kenney actually did. Eddie Rickenbacker, the top American ace of the First World War with 26 victories, had a standing offer. He would give a case of scotch to the first American pilot to beat his record. Kenney took that offer, and he turned it into an institution. He publicized his aces. He tracked their scores. He fed the newspapers. He turned 5 or 6 of his best pilots, Bong and Maguire, and Neil Kirby, and Tom Lynch, and Gerald Johnson, into celebrities. And he set them loose against each other and against the record. And it worked. Morale climbed. The newspapers back home ate it up. A war-weary public got heroes with names and faces and running scores, like a pennant race. Kenney got his aggression, his headlines, and his results. But I want to be honest with you about what he had actually built, because this is the heart of the whole thing. Kenney had turned combat aviation, the most lethal activity human beings have ever devised, into a competition with a scoreboard. And when you put a scoreboard on something, men will do things to move the number that they would never do for any other reason. That is the trap that closed on Tommy Maguire. And it is the machine that eventually decided Richard Bong was too valuable to be allowed to fly. Let me take you through the race itself, because the way these two men climbed the ladder tells you everything about how differently they flew. Bong passed Eddie Rickenbacker's old record on the 12th of April, 1944. His 26th and 27th victories put him past the First World War mark, and Kenney knew exactly what he had. He pulled Bong out of combat and sent him home on a bond tour to shake hands and sell war bonds and be photographed. Bong hated it. He called the publicity circuit worse than having a 0 on your tail, and I believe him completely, because everything about the man says he would rather have been shot at than smiled at. But Kenney had made his calculation, and the calculation was cold and correct. A living ace of aces selling bonds in Wisconsin was worth more to the war than one more pilot over New Guinea. Then Kenney did something that tells you the race was never really about fairness. He brought Bong back to the Pacific, but he did not give him a squadron to command. He gave him what amounted to a roving license. Bong was made an advanced gunnery instructor attached to 5th Fighter Command Staff, which meant on paper he was there to teach. He was ordered only to defend himself, not to go looking for fights. But of course, he went looking for fights. That was the entire point of putting him there, and everyone involved knew it. Bong was allowed to freelance, to attach himself to any mission he liked, to fly and fight where he pleased with none of the paperwork or the responsibility of command. He was a hunter with no fixed territory, and his score climbed. Maguire, meanwhile, was carrying the real load. He commanded the 431st Squadron. He led men. He flew the missions his group was assigned, not the missions he would have chosen, and he did it while running the daily business of a combat squadron in the field. He even wrote the thing down. In May of 1944, Maguire authored the 5th Air Force's own manual on combat tactics in the Southwest Pacific. Think about that. The man chasing the record wrote the rule book that other pilots were supposed to fly by. The rules he wrote were sound. They were built on hard experience. And one of the most important rules in that book, a rule about when to drop your external fuel tanks before a dogfight, is the exact rule Tommy Maguire would break in the last 90 seconds of his life. Hold that thought. We're coming to it. Through the autumn of 1944, as the Americans landed at Leyte and the fight moved into the Philippines, both men were scoring, and the newspapers were counting. Bong was ahead, but Maguire was gaining, and the gap between them narrowed to a handful of aircraft. This is where the stakes stop being about 2 pilots and start being about the war itself, because the Japanese air forces in the Philippines were being systematically destroyed, and every experienced ace on both sides knew that the supply of targets was running out. The record was not just a matter of skill anymore, it was a matter of time. Whoever ran out of enemy airplanes first would lose the race, and both men knew it. On the 17th of December 1944, over Mindoro, Richard Bong shot down an Oscar. It was his 40th victory, 40. No American had ever reached that number, and no American ever would. And with that 40th kill, the calm farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, became a problem for George Kenney. Because now Kenney had the greatest ace in American history, alive at the peak of his fame, flying combat missions over an enemy that still had teeth. And Kenney knew that if Bong died now, at 40, in some meaningless skirmish, it would be a catastrophe. Not a military catastrophe, but something almost worse, a story that ended wrong. So Kenney made the decision that defines this entire story. He grounded him. He pulled Richard Bong out of combat for good. Over 200 combat missions, more than 500 combat hours, 40 victories, and Kenney decided that was enough for any man, and that his greatest ace was now worth infinitely more as a symbol than as a soldier. In December of 1944, on Kenney's recommendation, General Douglas MacArthur personally presented Richard Bong the Medal of Honor at Tacloban Airfield on Leyte. MacArthur stood in front of the assembled men and inducted Bong into what he called the Society of the Bravest of the Brave. The photographers got their picture. The Ace of Aces had his medal, his record, and his orders home. He was going to live. Now here's the move that I think is the darkest and the most revealing thing Kenney ever did, and most people have never heard about it. When Kenney sent Bong home to his hero's welcome, he was afraid. He was afraid that Tommy Maguire, who was sitting on 38 victories and burning to close the gap, would break Bong's record before Bong even got off the boat in the United States. That would ruin the story. You cannot have a triumphant homecoming for the Ace of Aces if some other pilot has quietly taken the title while he was crossing the Pacific. So Kenney grounded Maguire too. He held him down, deliberately, not to protect him, but to protect Bong's welcome. He froze the scoreboard so the parade could happen, and only after Bong was safely home, safely photographed, safely celebrated, did Kenney let Maguire off the leash. I want to be careful and fair here, because Kenney genuinely loved these men, and he wrote a whole affectionate book about Bong after the war called Dick Bong, Ace of Aces. But love is not the same as care. And when I read what Kenney actually did, ground one man to keep him alive as a mascot, and ground the other man purely to preserve the first man's headlines, I do not see a father protecting his sons. I see a manager protecting an asset and managing a product launch. That is the workplace parallel this channel keeps coming back to, and this is the one time I will say it out loud in this video. If you have ever watched an organization take its single best performer, the one who actually does the work better than anyone, and turn that person into a mascot, a face for the brochure, and then act surprised when the very thing that made them exceptional is the thing that gets used up, then you already understand exactly what Kenney did. The pattern is old. It just does not usually get this many people killed. Because once Kenney unleashed Maguire, the clock was running, and Tommy Maguire knew it better than anyone alive. Just after Christmas, Maguire put on a display that should have ended the argument about who the better pilot was, if it had ever really been about that. On the 25th and 26th of December, 1944, over Luzon, escorting bombers against the Japanese airfields around Clark Field, Tommy Maguire shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. 7. In 48 hours. It brought his total to 38, and it earned him the Medal of Honor, which he would receive, though he would never live to wear it. He was now 2 victories behind Bong. 2. With Bong gone home and grounded, the record was, for the first time, actually reachable. All Maguire had to do was find 3 more airplanes in a sky that was rapidly emptying of them. And that is the situation, that exact situation, that put Tommy Maguire in the cockpit of a borrowed Lightning on the morning of the 7th of January, 1945. Let me slow all the way down here, because this is the collision this whole story has been driving toward, and because the details of this flight are fought over by historians to this day. I'm going to tell you what is known, and I'm going to tell you plainly where the evidence runs out and the arguments begin, because you deserve that, and because this audience checks. On that morning, Maguire took off from Leyte, leading a flight of 4 P-38s. It was not a mission he was ordered to fly. It was a voluntary fighter sweep, a hunting trip, over the northern part of Negros Island in the central Philippines. I have to pause on that word, Negros, because if you go and read Tommy Maguire's own Medal of Honor citation, it says he was killed over Los Negros Island. That is wrong. It is a documented error. Los Negros is a small island hundreds of miles to the southeast, in the Admiralty Group. Maguire died over Negros, a large island in the central Philippines. The men who wrote the citation got the name wrong, and that error has been copied into 1,000 accounts ever since. The crash site was found and documented on Negros, so if you have read that he died at Los Negros, now you know why, and now you know better. The purpose of the sweep was simple. Maguire wanted kills. His flight of 4 went looking for Japanese aircraft to shoot down, and they were flying with their external drop tanks still attached, because they had more ground to cover, and Maguire wanted the fuel to keep hunting. Those drop tanks matter enormously, so keep them in mind. At low altitude, somewhere around 1,500 feet, the flight encountered a single Japanese Army fighter, an Oscar, flown by a warrant officer named Akira Sugimoto. Now, a single Oscar against 4 P-38s should have been no contest. The Lightning was faster, more heavily armed, and flown by 2 of the most experienced pilots in the theater. But the Oscar was one of the most nimble aircraft in the entire war, and it was flown by a man who was very good, and it turned inside them. The Japanese pilot got onto the tail of one of Maguire's men. Maguire moved to save him, And here is the moment. Here is the decision the tactics manual he himself wrote would have told any other pilot to reverse. To turn hard enough to get the Oscar off his wingman, Maguire needed his airplane to be light and responsive. The right move, the move in the book, was to drop the external tanks immediately to shed the weight and the drag and let the lightning fight. Instead, Maguire made a call. He radioed his flight to save their tanks. Keep them. He was confident he could handle one lone fighter without giving up the fuel, and he did not want to cut the hunt short. So Maguire hauled his heavy, fully loaded P-38 into a violent low-altitude turn to get the Oscar off his man. And the airplane, overloaded, low and slow, did what an overloaded airplane does in a hard turn near the ground. It stalled. The wing quit flying. The lightning snap-rolled, went inverted, and dove into the ground in flames. Tommy Maguire was killed instantly. He was 24 years old. He was 2 victories short of the record he'd given his life to chase, and he died breaking the one rule he had written down for everyone else. That is the traditional account, and I believe the core of it is true. But I promised you honesty about where the evidence runs out, so here it is. Not one American pilot actually saw Maguire's airplane hit the ground. His wingman, Captain Edwin Weaver, saw the lightning go inverted and nose down. He did not see gunfire bring it down. He saw a fire and an explosion on the ground afterward. The organization that documents these crash sites, Pacific Rex, working from a detailed field investigation of the actual wreckage, is careful to say that the stall theory, however likely, is an assumption because there were no eyewitnesses to the impact itself. And there is a counter-argument, and it is not a crazy one. The official missing aircrew report attributed the loss to enemy action. The Japanese pilot Sugimoto had the position and the angle to have fired. Years later, another Japanese pilot who was there that day, a man named Mizunori Fukuda, insisted to interviewers that Sugimoto had shot Maguire down. One of the American survivors of the flight came to believe the Oscar had gotten enough of a firing angle to do it. So the honest answer, the answer I am comfortable giving you, is this. We do not know for certain whether Tommy Maguire stalled his airplane or was shot down while maneuvering. The physical evidence recovered from the crash site does not prove gunfire. Charles Martin, who wrote the fullest biography of Maguire, a book called The Last Great Ace, argues that Maguire had a genuine tactical reason to keep his tanks, but concludes in the end that Maguire habitually flew the P-38 past its limits, and that on that morning it finally caught up with him. In my view, that is the truest thing anyone has written about it. The precise mechanism does not really matter. Whether the wing stalled or the Oscar fired, Maguire was down in that fight, low and heavy and taking risks he would have ordered any other man not to take, for one reason. The number. He was chasing the record, and the record put him there. There is one more detail about that final flight that this audience will absolutely want, and it is another one people get wrong. Maguire was not flying his own airplane that day. He was not in Pudgy, the aircraft with his name and his victories painted on the nose. His own P-38L, the fifth to carry the Pudgy name, was unavailable, and Maguire flew a borrowed Lightning that belonged to another pilot in the group, an airplane named Eileen Ann. So when you see a painting or a model of Tommy Maguire's last flight showing him in Pudgy, that is the legend, not the fact. He died in another man's airplane, chasing his own record. There's a photograph of him standing next to an intact Pudgy just 2 days before the crash, which settles the matter. I mention it because the details are how you tell the truth from the myth, and this channel deals in the truth. The Japanese pilot Sugimoto did not survive the day either. His damaged Oscar came down and he was killed on the ground by Filipino guerrillas. The war in that corner of the sky consumed nearly everyone in it. So one of our 2 men is gone, dead in the mud on Negros, 2 kills short, in January of 1945. And the other man, the quiet one, the winner, is alive, safe, celebrated, and about to go home to a wedding. And you would think, if the story had any justice in it, that Richard Bong, at least, got to grow old. He did not. And the way he died is, if anything, an even sharper indictment of the machine that made him famous. Bong went home to Superior, Wisconsin, and on the 10th of February, 1945, he married Marjorie Vattendahl, the young woman whose face he'd carried into combat. And I mean that literally. Bong's most famous airplane, a P-38J model, was named Marge, and he had an enlarged, colorized photograph of Marjorie's face mounted on the nose. He flew that airplane, with his girlfriend's portrait staring out over the guns, for only about 3 months in early 1944. He was not even flying it when it was lost. Another pilot took Marge up on a weather flight, suffered an engine failure over New Guinea, and bailed out, and the airplane went into the jungle. It sat there, undiscovered, for 80 years. A recovery expedition finally located and confirmed the wreck of Marge in 2024, identifying it by the serial number stamped on a red-painted wingtip. But by then, everyone in this story had been gone for the better part of a century. Bong and Marge were married in front of roughly 1,200 guests in the national press. It was a genuine event. The Ace of Aces had his girl, his medal, and his life ahead of him. And then the Army did the thing that killed him, and it did it, once again. Because Richard Bong was too valuable to waste. You do not take the greatest fighter pilot in America and send him back to a farm. You use him. So the Army made Richard Bong a test pilot, and they assigned him to one of the most important and most dangerous flying jobs in the country, testing the brand new P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. This was cutting-edge, unforgiving work. Jet propulsion was in its infancy. The engines were temperamental, the systems were new, and the men who flew these airplanes were exploring the edge of what was possible, often the hard way. On the 6th of August, 1945, Richard Bong climbed into a P-80 at the Lockheed plant in Burbank, California, for an acceptance flight. It was only his 12th flight in the jet. He had accumulated a grand total of 4 hours and 15 minutes of flying time in the airplane. On takeoff, the primary fuel pump failed. There was a backup, an auxiliary pump, and the correct action was to switch to it immediately. For reasons no one will ever know, whether he forgot in the critical seconds, or could not reach it, or ran out of altitude, Bong did not make the switch. The engine starved. He tried to get out. He bailed out, but he was far too low for his parachute to open, and a witness said the airplane exploded before he even cleared it. Richard Bong was killed. He was 24 years old, the same age Maguire had been. The greatest ace in American history, a man who had survived over 200 combat missions and the heaviest fighting in the Pacific, died on a routine test flight over California, with less than 5 hours in the machine. And here is the cruelest part, the detail that tells you exactly where Richard Bong ranked in the grand scheme of things on the day he died. That same morning, the 6th of August, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The world changed forever before lunch. And so, in the newspapers the next day, the death of the Ace of Aces, America's greatest fighter pilot, ran as a small item underneath the headline that ended the world as people had known it. He had spent 3 years being the biggest story Kenney could manufacture. He died on the one morning in human history when nobody was looking. Let me pull these two threads together now, because when you lay the two deaths side by side, the pattern is almost unbearable in its symmetry. Tommy Maguire died in combat, low and heavy over Negros, breaking his own rule, because he was chasing a record that command had dangled in front of him for 2 years. Richard Bong died in an accident, stateside, in an experimental jet, in a test pilot job the Army gave him because his combat career had been ended to protect the record he already held. One man died reaching for the number. The other man died because he had the number and could not be allowed to just go home. The scoreboard killed the man who was behind by driving him to take a risk he knew better than to take. And the scoreboard killed the man who was ahead by making him too precious to retire and too famous to leave alone. There was no version of this race that ended with both of these men growing old. The machine did not allow for it. Now, let me spend a few minutes on how these two men actually flew and fought, because the contrast in the cockpit is the physical expression of the contrast in their characters, and this is where I want to give the airplane its due. The P-38 Lightning was unlike any other American fighter of the war, and it was perfectly suited to the Pacific. It had 2 Allison engines and that distinctive twin-boom layout, with the pilot sitting in a central pod between them. 2 engines meant that a pilot who lost one over open water, and the Pacific was almost nothing but open water, still had a chance to get home. That mattered more than any statistic can convey to men flying missions of 1,000 miles or more over an ocean that would kill you as surely as any Japanese pilot. But the feature that made the Lightning a killer, and the feature that suited both Bong and Maguire, was the guns. On almost every other fighter of the war, the guns were in the wings, angled inward to converge at a single point some distance ahead of the airplane. That meant your fire was only truly concentrated at one specific range, too close or too far, and your bullets spread apart. The P-38 was different. All of its guns, one 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns, were packed into the nose of the central pod, right in front of the pilot. They fired in a tight, parallel stream that did not converge and did not spread. That meant a P-38 pilot had deadly accurate fire at any range, from point blank to far out. Now think about what that meant for Richard Bong. the man who could not shoot deflection to save his life and who solved the problem by getting close. The Lightning was the ideal airplane for him. He could bore straight in, put that concentrated stream of cannon and machine gun fire directly into an enemy at a range where he simply could not miss, and pull off at the last possible instant. Some accounts say he did not always pull off in time. The airplane forgave his one weakness and amplified his one great strength, his nerve. I do not think it is an accident that the top two American aces of the war both flew this airplane. It rewarded exactly the kind of close-range aggression that both of them, in their different styles, brought to the fight. The versions of the Lightning changed over the course of the war, and it is worth being precise, because the airplane both men were flying at the end was not the airplane they started in. The early P-38G took the fight to the Japanese in 1942 and 43. The P-38H that Maguire scored his first victories in was, frankly, a flawed machine, because its cooling system could not let the engines run at full power without overheating, so the pilots were often held back by the airplane itself. It was the P-38J, the model of Bong's Marge, that fixed the cooling and turned the Lightning into a truly mature fighter, with better performance at altitude and, in its later versions, the dive recovery flaps and boosted controls that made it far safer to fly hard. And it was the most powerful version, the P-38L, with engines pushed to 1,600 horsepower, that both men flew at the very end. When Maguire hauled that fighter into its final fatal turn, he was flying the strongest, heaviest, most capable Lightning ever built, loaded with fuel near the ground. The airplane that could do the most was also the airplane with the least margin for the mistake he made. One more accuracy point, because I know this crowd, and I know somebody's about to type it into the comments. You will never see a correct picture of a Bong or Maguire P-38 wearing the black and white invasion stripes that covered Allied aircraft over Normandy in 1944. Those stripes were a European theater recognition marking, painted on for the invasion of France. They were never used in the Pacific. If you see a model or a painting of a Southwest Pacific Lightning wearing invasion stripes, it is wrong, and you already knew that, and I respect you for it. So how did the two men compare in the cold arithmetic of the record books? Bong finished with 40 confirmed victories, all in the P-38, the highest total ever achieved by an American. Maguire finished with 38, also all in the Lightning, the second highest. There is a tradition, and I want to flag it clearly as a tradition and not a fact, that Bong actually scored more than 40. His own commander, George Kenney, was convinced of it. Kenney believed Bong had a habit of giving away confirmed kills to his wingmen when Bong himself had done the shooting, out of that same quiet generosity that ran through the whole man. There are multiple accounts of it, but it was never entered into the official record, and I am not going to inflate the number here. 40 is the confirmed figure. The idea that it was really higher is a story people who knew Bong told about the kind of man he was, and I think it is probably true in spirit, even though it can never be proven in the books. To put those totals in context, because this audience appreciates where the greats stand in relation to each other. The top Navy ace, David McCampbell, finished with 34 victories and once shot down 9 aircraft in a single mission, which is its own staggering record. The top American ace in the war against Germany, Francis Gabreski, the man they called Gabby, scored 28 in Europe. Charles MacDonald, who commanded Maguire's own 475th Group, scored 27, also in the Lightning. In total, more than 1,200 American pilots qualified as aces in the Second World War. Bong and Maguire stand at the very top of all of them, first and second, and they have stood there, unbeaten for 80 years. And the airplane deserves a share of that glory. The P-38 Lightning shot down more than 1,800 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific Theater. More than 100 American pilots became aces flying it. 7 of the top 8 American aces in the entire Pacific War flew the Lightning. It was the only American fighter in continuous production from before Pearl Harbor all the way to the Japanese surrender. When people argue about the best American fighter of the war, and I know you argue about it because it is one of the things that fills this channel's comment section, the Lightning has as strong a claim as any airplane ever built. And the two men in this story are the strongest part of that claim. Now let me step back and tell you what I actually think this story means, because a channel that just recites scores is not worth your time, and you did not come here for a list. I believe the race of aces was one of the most brilliant and one of the most quietly corrosive things George Kenney ever did. Brilliant because it worked. It lifted a broken command off the floor. It gave a tired public heroes to believe in, and it produced aggression and results at a moment when the 5th Air Force desperately needed both. As a piece of leadership psychology, turning the war into a competition with a running score was genuinely masterful, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Kenney understood men, and he understood the press, and he used both. But here's the corrosion. When you make combat a competition, you change what the men in the cockpit are optimizing for. A pilot flying to complete a mission and bring his people home makes one set of decisions. A pilot flying to move a number makes a different set. And the difference between those two mindsets is measured in exactly the kind of risk that killed Tommy Maguire. Maguire did not keep his drop tanks that morning because he was stupid. He was one of the finest tactical minds in the theater. He wrote the book. He kept his tanks because he had spent 2 years being told by his own command, by the newspapers, by the whole apparatus around him, that the number was the point. And when the number's the point, you fly one more risky sweep. You take one more hard turn low to the ground. You keep the tanks so the hunt can continue. The scoreboard did not just record Maguire's death. It caused it. And notice what the race did to the man who won it. It did not reward Bong with a long life and a quiet retirement. It made him too valuable to release. His reward for reaching 40 was to become the Army's property in a new way, a symbol to be deployed, a test pilot to be used, a face that could not simply be allowed to go home to the farm because the machine had one more use for him. Kenney and MacArthur did not hate Richard Bong. They admired him enormously. But admiration inside a large institution has a way of curdling into ownership, and I think Bong, in the end, was owned. He belonged to the war effort right up until the morning he died in a jet he barely knew, on the one day the world was too busy to notice. That is the pattern this channel exists to name. It is not that the men who commanded were villains. Kenney was not a villain. He genuinely wept over these men. It is that the system, the institution, the machine, has its own logic, and that logic treats even its most gifted people as resources to be allocated, publicized, and, when necessary, spent. Bong and Maguire were the two best fighter pilots America ever produced. The bureaucracy could put their faces on posters, it could track their scores and feed the newspapers and stage their medal ceremonies, but it could not create them, and in the end, it could not keep them. The one thing the machine could not manufacture was the two men themselves, and the one thing it could not do for all its power was let them live. If your father or your grandfather flew with the 49th Fighter Group, or the 475th, the Flying Knights or Satan's Angels, or if he worked the flight line keeping those lightnings in the air over New Guinea and the Philippines, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Those stories matter, and this is exactly the audience that carries them. Drop them in the comments. Some of the best history on this channel comes from you in the replies, correcting me and adding what the books left out. Let me leave you with the symmetry that started us off, because it is the truest summary of the whole thing. Two men, born the same year, winged the same winter, flying the same airplane, first and second on the list of the greatest American aces who ever lived. One quiet, one loud, one who died reaching for the record over a Philippine island, breaking the rule he wrote himself. One who died after he had won it in a jet over California on the morning the atomic age began. The Japanese did not beat either of them. The number did. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.